We're back, and we're going to talk about movement in birds. Birds, of course, have an adaptation to fly that makes them different from all other vertebrates. And that, in turn, has affected their skeletal and muscle structures. Probably we should start with the bones of the bird. That, again, on the lab exam, you're going to be expected to know the bones of the bird. There is a page in the appendix of your lab manual that has a picture of a bird skeleton, and you need to go in there and be able to label most of the bones of the bird. So you need to be able to recognize the skull, obviously at the top, the vertebrae that comes down and has a long, flexible neck, and then here towards the bottom of the body, the vertebrae fuse with the pelvis. It has a humerus, a radius and an ulna, and some phalanges out here. In this case, the phalanges are relatively small and reduced, but that would actually be where the feathers that are most involved with flight, the primary feathers, attach. On the lower part of the bird, I don't know if I can get to this, we have this big structure here that's called the sternum.
Or the keel.
Or the keel. In terms of the function of that big keel, that is where the muscles attach to fly. For birds to fly, they have to move their arms down. When they move their arms down, it does two things. It creates lift, pushing them up, and also from where the shape of the feathers, it creates a back motion that creates a force to force them through the air. To do that, they need to have big muscles to pull those arms down with a huge amount of force. To do that, they have, which muscles, Dr.
The pectoralis muscle is very enlarged on a bird. If you can see on this preserved specimen here, this would represent this whole structure in here. There's a pectoralis muscle. We commonly refer that to the breast muscle in a chicken, and that is attached very firmly to the sternum. So you think a very large muscle would need a very large attachment area, so hence the sternum is enlarged on a bird.
So basically that muscle runs from the sternum up through a hole above the femur, above the humerus, and then runs out and attaches to the humerus. So when it contracts, it pulls that humerus down with a tremendous amount of force. And that is the primary structures that are involved in flight. Now, the fused part of the skeleton here, where the vertebrae and the hip joints are all sort of fused together there, help create what I sometimes call, for lack of a better word, a rigid airframe. That the bird, when it's flying, is being lifted by where the humerus joins the skeleton. If all those bones could droop down behind that, the poor bird would be lifting and falling down behind it and create a lot of drag when they fly. By having all of those fused together, it creates an airframe that relatively few muscles can hold up and hold in a straight line, so when they fly, their tail end is not drooping down.
When they think about when they build an airplane and they construct the fuselage, there's thousands of rivets and thousands of points of attachment to make that fuselage as rigid as possible. Because there's a lot of forces on the airframe when you're trying to move through the air. A lot of forces moving in one direction. You don't want to be twisting and turning and being floppy in flight because you would not be able to sustain a straight line. Okay? So the fused bones make the bird rigid for that purpose in flight. But what's the disadvantage of having all those fused bones for when a bird would have to walk on land? Think about if you ever observed the walking motion of a chicken or a goose or a duck. Would you describe that as being a fluid motion, or would you describe that as being awkward, stiff, waddling-like motion? So think about that. All relates back. When you fuse bones, you have fewer joints, and you lose flexibility. Advantage for flight, not such an advantage for walking.
Right. I don't know if you can film me doing this or not, but I'll try to do this. If you watch it how a duck or a chicken walks, it basically leans its body in one direction, swings the whole body forward and then puts that down, lifts the other leg up, swings the whole body forward, puts that leg down, so that it's waddling as it walks. Part of that is because it doesn't have the flexibility in the hip joint to walk the way we do.
I think the other thing you can relate to that is some people have spinal injuries when they have to fuse vertebrae in your backbone. What does that immediately do to their range of motion? It limits it. So you're losing that flexibility when you fuse bones. Now, the other advantage of why birds would tend to fuse bones is what force are birds trying to overcome when they fly? The force of gravity. More fused bones mean fewer bones, mean lighter airframe, less energy and force required to get off the ground to overcome gravity. Okay, if I'm going to attempt to pick up the mammalian bone, and I'm actually struggling though. It is a heavy bone, really strong bone, but if I would pick up the equivalent size bird bone, whoop, very light, very light. Essentially it's hollow inside, okay? And so, well, if you ever broken up a chicken bone after eating wings, you can see, if you break that open, it is essentially very thin bone, hollow in the inside.
Which again is an adaptation of weight saving, which is tremendously important if you're trying to put mass through the air. I will say something really quickly here that isn't related to what we're doing right now, but is indirectly. Birds also have a different respiratory system. Flying requires the bird to expend a tremendous amount of energy flapping those darn wings. And to do that, they need to provide lots of oxygen to their red blood cells. As a consequence, they have a respiratory system that is very different than ours. They don't have to take a breath and exhale. The air actually moves through and back out their lung system without having to inhale and exhale. And so they actually have a respiratory system that's much more efficient than ours in terms of being able to get oxygenated blood to those muscles that are flapping the wings.